welcome to this panel. It's called The Real High Income Trap, Political Money, Political Establishments, and Power. I'm David Sirota with International Business Times and Newsweek. This is a particularly important subject for me in my work. I report primarily on money and politics, so I'm really looking forward to this panel. And I'll introduce the folks on the panel. We have Julia Cagé, who's an assistant professor of economics at Sciences Po Paris. We have Chen, a university statistician. I'm going in the wrong direction, so let me start over. So we have Julia Cagé over there. We have Mirko, who's an associate professor in the Department of Economics at Warwick University. We have Tom Ferguson, who's INET's research director. We have Paul Jorgensen, the assistant professor of political science at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. And we have Chen, who is a university statistician at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And so the panelists are each going to present, and we will start with Julia.
Thank you very much, and thanks for organizing this conference. And
my mic does not seem to be working.
yeah, but and thanks for the invitation.
They fixed it.
So I'm going to present you my work joint with Yasmine Bekouche on the price of a vote. And I'm going to show you evidence from France. So I think if you all attend this conference today, and more broadly this INET event, is that you should know that money matters in politics. And in a sense, you will have much more evidence at the end of this morning of the role played by money. Politics receive more and more money. Politicians, they spend more and more on campaign. And there is an increasing risk that with rising inequality, money may increasingly corrupt politics. The paper here look at the impact of campaign spending and financing in France with a focus of all the local elections, mayoral elections at the city level, and legislative elections for the MP in France from 1993 to 2014, exploiting a number of changes in legislations and distinguishing, and I think that's key, between different sources of funding. So whether people use their own money, whether they use money coming from their political party, or whether they receive private donations. There are two main goals of what I'm going to present you. The first one is descriptive. I want to understand the evolution and the change of the role played by money in France during the last 3 decades. And the second one, and I think this is key, is to determine the causal impact of spending on votes. And there are two key empirical challenges on which I'm going to insist. The first one is the fact that France is a multi-party electoral system, which is a huge difference compared to what we are used to study mainly in the literature, which is American politics. And in the US, you just have the Democrat and the Republican. And at the end of the day, the politics of it can be complex, but the reality is just about like two parties playing one against each other. While in France, as you would see, you can have up to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 parties running in elections, with a number of them really mattering. And the second one, obviously, will be to deal with this endogeneity of spending. So why France? This is not only because I am French, I guess, as you may have realized from my accent. The first reason is that since 1988, France has enacted a number of very important reforms to reduce the role played by money into politics, and I'm going to come back to that. So we tend to be very happy, from a French point of view, to look at the US and to say, oh, look, in the US, they have no longer any regulation, they're spending so much money into politics. At least in our country, we are doing pretty well. What I'm going to show you is that money matters, including in France, despite this existing regulation. And what is good with French data is that there is a lot of data available. A lot of it was in paper format, but we can build the story of money in politics in France, like over 3 decades. And the second reason, I think one of the limitations of the existing literature on money in politics is the focus on the US. And the US is a system with 2 parties. But if you look at the vast majority of democracies in the world, this is not specific to France. There are much more than 2 parties. So I think it's kind of useful to see and study the role played by money in a system with like more than just 2 parties. So just to give you a sense of the results, I am going to show you that there is a large, not to say very large, positive impact of spending on votes, both for municipal and legislative elections. And at the end of the day, according to the estimate we have, the price of a vote is of around €6, which is not so expensive. And then you will see that the effect is mainly driven by private donations and personal contributions, with one phenomenon that I'm going to document, even if it may not be so surprising for you, is that right-wing parties, they tend to receive much more private donations than left-wing parties. So then they can spend more, and given that a vote is kind of cheap, this may change the results of the election. And one of the questions is through which channel does it work? And I'm going to document the fact that there is kind of a mobilization effect. So when there is more spending, people, they turn out more, but they tend to turn out and vote in favor of the parties that spent more money. Let me jump on that just to tell you one thing. I think this is important to provide evidence on the role played by money on countries outside of the US, and there is a few. So this is the beginning of a new research agenda. I'm still working on France because there is much more things we can do on France, and the next step I would like to work on is the UK and perhaps Germany. So I think we really need to document the role played by money in European politics. And the second thing, the particularity of this paper, in a sense, this is the first attempt at estimating the causal impact of spending with multi-party electoral data. So in a sense, outside of the United States. So let me describe you very quickly local elections in France. So we have two kinds of elections. We have these municipal mayoral elections. And for that, we have data between 1995 and 2014. The way it works, this is a two-round list system with proportional representation. So for all French elections, we always have two rounds, which may explain why you have a lot of parties. While with a one-round voting system, it's obvious that at the end of the day, you will end up with only two parties. And then we will also look at legislative elections, which is also a two-round system with single-member constituencies, and we have data covering 1993 to 2012. And I did my best to get the data for 2017, and I think it was a key year in French politics. Obviously, I have the vote share for 2017, but still not the money. So waiting for the money, and I hope I will be able to come back in 1 year and to present you the results, taking into account 2017. Knowing that 2017, money should have played a big role because Emmanuel Macron, who won the election, won it without any political party, created his own party, so he funded a lot of his campaign through private donations. What I'm going to show you is that there is a specific effect of private donations on the vote shares that a candidate can obtain. So in terms of campaign finance reforms, in fact, the first campaign finance reforms, they came up pretty late in France. You have to wait until 1988. So if you compare to the US, in the US it was 1971. But at the time we decided to regulate in France, like the regulation was already being destroyed by the Supreme Court in the US. And in France it came in 1988, like in Belgium in 1989, around the same time. In the UK it came much later. So it took much time in Europe to regulate politics than in the US in a sense, but we are still building and not destroying this regulation. So basically until 1988 it was a non-transparent system because parties were not allowed to accept donations, but they were not receiving public subsidies. So all the money was dark money, basically. Since 1988, you have direct public funding of parties, which broadly depends on the legislative results, as well as indirect public funding in the form of the public reimbursement of candidates for election campaign costs. So in 1990, you have the creation of a commission that is in charge of reviewing the account of the parties and candidates. So all the parties and candidates have to send their data to this commission. And basically, this is the data we use in the paper. This is paper data that we digitize and merge together, organize. I have to say thanks to INED funding. So this was very useful because without this funding, we won't have been able to perform this research. And at the end of the day, we built this new data set on money in French politics. So you have a number of roles. Candidates are not allowed to spend more than a certain spending limit. You will see that the limit is pretty low, but compared to the low price of a vote, it's not so low at the end of the day. And it mainly depends on the electoral district. So for example, if you take a city like Nice. So I tried to pick a French city that was not Paris and that everyone may know about. So this is Côte d'Azur, so this may be the higher probability that you went to Nice at some point. In a city like Nice, you know, a candidate is allowed to spend up to 250,000 euros for a municipal election. In legislative election, you have had a number of change in regulation and like a decrease in the threshold, in particular in 1997 compared to 1993. And one argument that I'm going to make, and I think that have never been made before, is that this may have played an important role in the fact that the right lost the 1997 election in France. So in 1997, the French president, Jacques Chirac, decided out of nowhere, it was like a complete surprise, even for all the journalists, to dissolve the National Assembly. And he did it because he was sure that the right was going to win again. And they lost. And you will see that one of the main drivers of the fact that they lost is that they were not able to spend as much money as they were used to. And so they were like spending levels that were like more equivalent to what the left was doing at the time. So in terms of sources of funding, you have private donations since 1995, but it was applied for the first time in 1997. Private donations from legal entities are forbidden in France, and private donations from natural individuals, natural persons, they are like limited, so up to 4,600 euros, and you can give up to 7,500 euros to political parties, and this is tax deductible. You also have personal contributions, party contributions, contribution in kind. And this is not an anecdote. I think this tells us a lot. So you don't have to, in general, your revenues are equal to your spending. You cannot spend more than what you receive. But in some cases, candidates, they receive much more than what they spent. And if you look at the names, in this case, for example, what you find is like the prime minister at the time, who was receiving much more money for his campaign at the municipal level than what he was allowed to spend. So then this is not even like votes that you are trying to buy, obviously, because you cannot spend the money to buy the votes. It's limiting by the threshold, but you may want to buy some influence. There is like public funding of the campaign, and in particular, candidates are refunded by the state up to 47.5% of the spending limit. So let me just go very quickly through the data. We have data on the vote shares for all the candidates that run in the election, municipal elections, local elections, and that is key. We have this campaign spending data for around 46,000 candidates time election that we merge with the vote data using the name of the candidate, and this is this paper data that you find in the archive, and that we digitize and merge. So you know this is the example of a city, and for the city you have for each candidate, you have the name, you have the spending, you have the revenues, and you have the sources of the revenues. And in case you know the account were contested by the commission, you also have some information on that. Okay. So in terms of spending, on average, the total spending by candidate for municipal election is not so high, it's around 25,000 euros. Per voter, it's a little bit more than €1 per voter. If you look at the total amount of spending spent per voter in France for a municipal election, on average, it's just below €5. So we are not so far from the price of a vote at the end of the day. Okay. If you look for municipal elections, the amount spent, like the campaign is like less costly for a candidate than for municipal elections, in particular because the thresholds are much lower since the change in regulation in 1997. But overall, this is more costly because you have much more candidates running in the legislative elections than in the municipal elections. And let me just like show you like two plots that I think make a lot of sense just to get a sense of what is happening. What you have here on and this is like, this comes directly from you. Like this was like, Tom asked me, you should have a look at, you should plot that and see what you will find in the data. I guess you will find the first diagonal. This is not so far from the first diagonal, so you were right. And this is what you find both for municipal elections and for legislative elections. On the x-axis, you have the share of total spending, and on the y-axis, you have the share of total votes. And this is not so far from being perfectly correlated. For all the municipal elections we have here, and for all the legislative elections too. So then I'm going to do better than that and to try to document the causal impact. But even if that is just a simple correlation, this is kind of a striking correlations. In terms of sources of revenues, so revenues, money for politics, it comes from private donations, party contributions, personal contributions, and in-kind contributions. For legislative elections, party contributions matter much more than for municipal elections, in particular because a lot of candidates in the municipal elections, they run without any party. But what you see is that private donation in both cases, it accounts for around 15% of the revenues. What is interesting is to look at the difference between parties. So here you have a simple breakdown for municipal election between the extreme left, the right, and the extreme right. And the last column, I just look at the difference between the left and the right. And what you see is that on average, right-wing candidates, they receive an extra 3,500 euros in private donation. That is directly reproduced at an extra 3,000 euros in spending. Then knowing that the price of a vote that I'm going to estimate is around 6 euros, it means that you can buy nearly 20,000 votes just thanks to this difference in the amount of private donations you receive. And if you do the same thing for the legislative elections, so where we have more details for the political parties, so you have communist, green, socialist right, extreme right, you see that there is an extra 7,000 euros for candidates from the right compared to candidates from the Socialist Party. If you look at the Socialist Party, like 10,000 euros, but then the smaller party, like the Communist Party, this is just 2,000 euros, and then the Green Party and the extreme right party, they receive nearly no private money at all. So let me just explain you why I think it's important to look at these multi-party data things, just because, you know, when you have like two parties, it's kind of easy to see what is happening, because one party is going always to receive 100% of the vote minus the vote shares of the other party. With like 7, 8, or 9 parties, this is much more complicated, and you need to be sure to satisfy two conditions. At the end of the day, when you have your estimation, is that the vote share of each party will be between 0 and 1, and the total of the vote share will never be higher than 1. So I'm not going to enter into the detail, but basically this is the main empirical challenge we try to tackle, and we think we can reproduce the same kind of analysis for other multi-party countries like Germany or the UK, for example. So, okay, let me jump on that and just show you the results. So what you can do is to estimate the effect of spending on vote. And what you find, first of all, if you look at the diagonal, spending matters, and it matters for all the political parties. So when the Communist Party spent, it increased the Communist Party vote share. When the Green Party spent money, it increased the vote share for the Green Party. But the magnitude of the effect is higher for the right-wing party. So I just thought, let's do a counterfactual experiment, and let's assume two things, a little bit extreme in both cases, but just to try to get a sense of what is the price of a vote. First, let's assume that the right-wing party candidates are not allowed to spend. Everything else equal, just assume that the right-wing candidates are now spending 0. And let's do the reverse thought experiment and assume that the right-wing candidates are spending up to the limit. So all of them are going to spend 4 euros, knowing that on average in the data they spend 0.64 per registered voter. Let's take all the elections. So I'm showing you the results for the legislative elections, each election between 1993 to 2012. And let's look at the change in the vote obtained by the right-wing parties in both cases. What is the change in how much is spent? What is the change on how many votes they obtain? And at the end of the day, if you look at the different elections, the price of a vote, it moved from 2.5 for 2007 up to 6.8. And if you average over all this estimation, you have like a 6 euro price just for a vote. So de facto, you can say in France, we have like kind of strong spending limits, but obviously this is kind of far from being enough, given that a vote is so cheap. And you can do it depending on the source of funding, but given that I'm to respect the time clock, I just prefer to show you one thing, which is the IV using a change in legislation, and in particular using the fact that beginning in 1995, but it applies for the first time in the 1997 elections, there were a ban in France on donations from legal entities. So legal entities were no longer allowed to give money to political candidates. What was the impact of this ban? This is kind of striking. If you just plot what I did here, the amount of donations by legal persons in 1993 compared to the change in how much they spent between 1997 and 1993, you have a negative relationship, and this is strongly correlated. So basically, it means that the right-wing candidates that we see both in 1993 and in 1997, who between both elections lost as a source of funding donations from legal entities, they spent much less in 1997. So what we do in the paper is that we instrument the change in spending between 1993 and 1997, knowing again that the 1997 election was unexpected. It should have taken place in 1998 by the donations from legal persons in 1993. And even if you do that and you show it, you see it on this graph. This is just for 1987, so you have less observation. But what is kind of striking is if you compare the coefficient you obtain with a naive estimate with the instrumented coefficient using the IV, they basically does not change. So there is more than the correlation here, and you have a positive causal impact of spending on vote shares. So just, what we find here for France, from 1993 to 2014, we have like 9 elections in total, is that money play a role, but not only money play a role marginally, but the price of a vote is so low that this suggests that we need for sure to introduce stronger spending limitations, and I guess this goes hand in hand, more equal public funding. And one, like the bottom line of this paper, but this is more like of this research agenda, so doing it for France, but also for other European countries, the bottom line is really that private money is a danger for democracy in the US, and we will see it today, but not only in the US, also in Europe, and we have to change law to take that into account if we want to preserve the future of democracy. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks very much. So what I want to do today is just kind of give you a brief review of some work I've been doing with Rocco de Est at Sussex and Christian von Rosen at UPF on shadow lobbying, and kind of give a general commentary on lobbying in the US and money and politics research. Okay, so it's very clear that the workings of the political institutions now established democracies are being challenged by recent populist revolts, right? A big feature of the Trump-led populist revolt in the US has been this idea of attacking the perceived self-dealing of political elites, right? And it's symbolized by this "drain the swamp" slogan that was a major feature of Trump's campaign. And I think the way you can see "drain the swamp" is as summarizing this idea that political money channeled through special interests has caused this massive malfunction of representative government, okay? And as researchers, okay, therefore, like when we're looking at money in politics, the issue the scientific question that we want to ask is, how is political money affecting our institutions, right? Specifically, what you want to think of as a scientific issue is, how does this massive flow of political money influence the incentives and norms that are needed for these institutions to function, right? So when we have political money in the system, that's going to affect the incentives of politicians in terms of the kind of actions that they take on policy, right? When they're kind of minded to take account of, the potential effects on political contributions. When we have political money flowing through the lobbying system, that's going to affect the decisions of people working in the political system, such as political staffers, right? So given this, right, so the scientific context is incentives and the norms of behavior in our political system. That leads us to ask these questions about, what kind of policy tools have we got available to fix these problems that are perceived to be created by money in politics? How effective are these tools? and can we do better? And so the focus of what I want to talk about is the empirics of US federal lobbying, which we've worked on before in our revolving door lobbyist paper, and a specific aspect of how well current US lobbying regulation is working. And just to give you an idea of the context of why we're asking this question, it's kind of obvious, but it's worth just restating it to create the context. Lobbying is a regulated sector because we fear that lobbyists can use the knowledge and contacts that they acquire in government to benefit private interests and push particular agendas. As a result, we've created transparency rules. The basic principle kind of enshrined in US lobbying disclosure legislation is that we accept that people have the freedom to lobby and that lobbying is part of political representation and important to the political system, but we want safeguards against special interest influence, and specifically we want to observe the activities of special interests through transparency rules. And what I want to give you now is a discussion of our empirical study of US lobbying rules, specifically the lobbying rules created by the Lobbying Disclosure Act, a cornerstone of US kind of lobbying legislation. So the Lobbying Disclosure Act was created or introduced in 1995, and what it did was create an official register of lobbying activities in terms of lobbying reports, right? And that created a lot of information on the lobbying firms working in lobbying, the people working for those firms, their past employment history, and the issues that they were lobbying on, okay? And as a result of this, that created a big, interesting database for looking at money in politics around lobbying issues, okay? And one aspect of the Lobbying Disclosure Act was that it required lobbyists, people engaged in lobbying, to register if at least 20% of their time was spent on lobbying activity, right? So big challenges to the LDA have emerged over time. Firstly, there was the Abramoff scandal in the early to mid-2000s, and that inspired the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act in 2007, which introduced a number of kind of additional regulations, such as cooling off restrictions on lobbyists. And more recently, there's been a further perceived erosion of the LDA in terms of reporting behaviour. And the focal point of this perceived erosion is that 20% rule on the self-reporting of lobbying activity. So the LDA, just to give you an idea of what we're working with, it provides quite detailed definitions of lobbying activity, the kind of activity that you have to report in terms of the definition of lobbying and the timing of the activity. And it's this kind of detailed information that, that can be parsed and spliced and creates potential loopholes. And two high-profile cases essentially summarize what our empirical work is about, right, in terms of this 20% rule. So firstly, there's the case of Tom Daschle, ex-leader in the Senate, who, when he retired from the Senate, began working for the lobbying firm Alston and Bird, and with a major lobbying, firm with a major lobbying practice, but did not officially register as a lobbyist because he was invoking this 20% rule, right? That is, claiming that while he may contribute to Alston and Bird's lobbying activity, it's not taking up more than 20% of his time, okay? And so this essentially, Daschle is the symbol or the poster boy for this 20% rule, and in some contexts, this 20% rule has been known as the Daschle exemption, okay? And he's gone on to work for a number of lobbying firms until finally registering as a lobbyist last year. The other kind of notable example is Newt Gingrich, right? So this became a big issue in the 2012 election when people were kind of challenging Gingrich on his history as an advisor or perceived lobbyist for Freddie Mac, right? And so what Gingrich was claiming was that he was invoking this idea of the 20% rule, or this kind of nebulous idea that he was actually just a generic strategic policy advisor, and that he was offering Freddie Mac his expertise as a historian, right? So Gingrich has a PhD in the history of the Belgian Congo, and presumably he was advising, using that expertise on the history of the Belgian Congo to advise on US financial issues, right? And so, and that kind of led, that's obviously in the crowd today, there's a lot of skepticism of that. And, one interesting thing is that Gingrich is also now, like if you kind of dig into news reports, he's also now active in advising people on, like advising firms in terms of potential access to Trump, lobbying access to Trump, okay? So these are the two big examples. These symbolize what we're trying to do here. Right? And so just to give you an idea of like, why are these people doing this, right? So, this is not just Gingrich and Daschle and ex-congressmen. This is, as you'll see, a whole wave of former congressional staffers kind of entering lobbying firms or working for lobbying firms without registering. There's incentives for them to do this, okay? So firstly, the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act introduced these additional kind of cooling off restrictions which prevented people from directly lobbying certain contacts for 2 years after leaving the Congress. A big thing has been Obama's Executive Order 12490, and that kind of introduced this reverse revolving door cooling off restrictions where it prevented people from taking up positions in the Obama administration in areas on which they directly lobbied previously. Right, so, and in cases, Ashton Carter, for example, had to be granted a waiver to become Defense Secretary because he previously worked for defense contractors, right? So that had a big effect on lobbyists' career decisions. And then in general, as we've seen, there's this general career stigma that has emerged from being, having lobbyist experience on your CV, which might lead you to try and avoid registering as a lobbyist. Okay, so given that context, given this Daschle rule, the idea of our empirical work is to look for evidence of credible, economically significant patterns of unregistered lobbying in the US, at the federal level in the US, okay? And what we do here is build up firm and worker level or lobbyist level panel data from Lobbying Disclosure Act records on registered lobbying revenues, okay? So the basic idea of this in terms of the research design is that while these ex-congressmen and ex-congressional staffers are not registered, their revenue earning power could still potentially turn up in the data. That is, when Tom Daschle joins a firm or when Newt Gingrich or a prominent ex-congressional staffer joins a firm, their presence at that firm will still attract and increase the value of the lobbying contracts coming into that firm. Right? And those officially registered lobbying revenues, so these are officially registered lobbying revenues that are still part of the LDA, and therefore we can take this empirical strategy of looking at the timing of the entry of these potential unregistered shadow lobbyists, the timing of their entry into the firm, to look at potential revenue effects on the officially registered revenues. So you can think of this as what we're trying to look for here is seeing if they cast some type of shadow on official firm revenues, right? So when you have Tom Daschle in your firm or you have a major ex-congressional staffer in your firm, that's going to increase the value of your lobbying business, right? So, and so that's the kind of empirical design that we're adopting here. So what we do in this, and just to give you an idea of the nitty-gritty of the empirics, is that we build this big database of potential shadow lobbyists. So firstly, and the main part of that is to build up a database of ex-congressional staffers who leave working in the Congress, then begin to work in registered lobbying firms, but do not officially register as lobbyists, okay? And then the second part of it is kind of following up on the Daschle and Gingrich examples of searching through all of the different biographies of ex-congressmen and seeing if they go on to work for lobbying firms after they leave the Congress. So that sounds easy, but it's like a very difficult empirical task. So this is an indication of what we're seeing in the data, okay? So the lobbying sector can be split between a lobbying firm sector and an in-house lobbying sector. So think of the in-house sector as Google's official lobbying shop in Washington or Walmart's official lobbying shop in Washington. The basic idea of our study is that we can find the smoking gun of this unregistered lobbying activity in this firm level information, right? So when these potential shadow lobbyists enter into lobbying firms, they can potentially attract new clients or increase the value of the contracts for existing clients, right? So kind of part of the design is that while we find some evidence of, we find this increase in potential shadow lobbyists in the in-house sector, it's really on the firm sector that we focus our empirical modeling. And then furthermore to that, what we do is we focus on the bigger firms in the lobbying firm sector, right? Because, well, for two reasons is, firstly, we think that that's where, if you're going to conduct shadow lobbying activity, you're more likely to, let's say, hide your activities in a larger firm, right, where you're able to hide behind more bodies. And that's indeed what we find in the data, is that most of this unregistered potential lobbying activity is going into the larger firms where people, would be more able to hide their activity, or if you were to kind of pass it in the official terms, there's more complementarities with like a wider set of resources in the lobbying firm. Okay, and so what we end up with is, amongst these lobbying firms, we're getting this estimate that this pool of potential unregistered lobbyists represents potentially about 5 to 10% of the overall pool of kind of lobbyists or people working on, potentially working on lobbying issues within these large lobbying firms in Washington. And then, so an additional thing just to discuss is that, it seems that this shadow lobbying activity seems to shoot up from the mid to late 2000s onwards. So one of the kind of big data collection activities that we did was conduct an independent census of potential unregistered lobbying activity in around the mid-2000s. And to do that, I can go into the gory detail afterwards if you like, but to do that, we went through the Wayback Machine to look at lobbying firm websites in the mid-2000s, just to kind of comprehensively check that there wasn't a lot of potential, what we think of as potential unregistered lobbying activity going on in that era. So our kind of strong conclusion so far is that this potential unregistered lobbying activity is a phenomenon of the late 2000s, that it kicks off in earnest in the late 2000s. All right, so in terms of the modeling, the basic idea is that we're looking for revenue effects, positive revenue effects accruing after the entry of these potential shadow lobbyists, and we seem to see that quite clearly. So when we line every entering lobbyist up in terms of some event-style analysis, what we're seeing is an effect of about 10 to 15% at the mean. When you're looking at the actual numbers, the interesting stuff to note here is that probably in that last column, where the main pool of potential lobbyists are these ex-staffers, like one ex-staffer shadow body represents a 15% increase in revenue versus like a 9% increase in revenue for an officially registered ex-staffer. In the more detailed modeling, what we're basically finding is that these unregistered ex-staffers, their revenue effects are basically equivalent to a top-end senior or superstar officially registered ex-staffer, right? So these seem to be the high-value guys that are mainly working in these potentially unregistered lobbying roles. So those are the punchlines, is that this group of unregistered workers is associated with big spikes in revenues. The size of this effect is large relative to what we would accept if they were observing the letter of the rule in terms of working only 20% of their time. Like, what we're observing is that these effects are basically equivalent to a full-time top-end superstar lobbyist. And in terms of the data, this is a challenge to transparency that's growing, right? So what we're looking at here is just this kind of set of people working in officially registered lobbying organizations. There's a whole potential shadow economy of lobbying out there in unregistered organizations such as think tanks, right? Okay, so I just want to close off with a discussion of the policy implications. So, and the thing I want to note is that this specific issue of loopholes in lobbying reporting was invoked by Trump during the election and was part of the Drain the Swamp agenda. And you can see from this quote in late October 2017, he was talking about this right up until the election, right? And therefore, it's kind of worth talking about what has been the wash-up in terms of policy from this rhetoric, right? And the way I look at this is that, and this general issue of money in politics and how Trump is pushing forward the drain of the swamp issue, is that we need to avoid being distracted by the culture war kind of discussion that is dominating political debate, right? And I think what this panel will show is that money in politics is still in play and is a dominant force in our politics, and that the swamp that people like Trump talk about and the problems implicit in that swamp are as deep as ever, okay? And specifically, I think what we've got to remember in this environment of a culture war is that special interests and their money will still be there when Trump is gone, whether that's in 3 years or in 7 years, okay? And we can't forget about this important role of money in politics. And there's a lot of examples of this, right? So beneath the coverage of culture war type issues, you can dig out some kind of concerning examples of what's going on in terms of money in politics and lobbying regulations. So it's clear that there's a big wave of ex-lobbyists entering into the Trump administration. Trump has given at least as many waivers as Obama did in his first year and has not strengthened those particular ethic rules about ex-lobbyists working in the administration. This article from the New York Times documents how lobbyists have mobilized to provide services in terms of access to the Trump administration, and Gingrich has been active in this type of activity. And I think probably the most concerning thing is this big wave of lobbying activity that we're seeing mobilize on regulatory issues, okay? There's a lot of important policy issues at play, and lobbyists have spotted these issues. And as I said, the swamp is as deep as ever in that respect. And so the way I'll kind of conclude this is that, it's just to pick up on these themes of money and politics that we're trying to build up in this panel, is that, the way looking forward in terms of, how this Trump administration may unfold is that I think the entrenching of special interests through things such as this wave of activity that we're about to see on regulatory issues may be one of the big legacies of the Trump presidency, along with these kind of regressive distributional policies that we're seeing in areas like healthcare and tax, right, that are coming down the pike. And therefore, in our discussions of what's happening in the political system, we need to remember these issues about regulating the special interest economy, and that indeed Trump is vulnerable to this because of the rhetoric that he has rolled out in the past about political elites and self-dealing amongst political elites, right? And he's made quite explicit and clear commitments on this issue that he should be held accountable for. And then the kind of final thing I'll just say is that kind of this panel in general kind of reinforces the need for work like this, empirically focused work on political money to keep going. Okay, thanks.
Hi, folks. Our paper is by the three of us. We've only got 20 minutes. Chen didn't really want to talk. She was able to handle questions. So Paul and I are going to split the exposition. We got to cover a lot of ground. We can hardly be expected to disagree with anything that was said by our co-panelists here. So let's just get right. First problem you got in understanding the presidential election in the U.S. is, the basic problem is, what's the basic problem? There's a couple of big distractions, okay? One is the FBI director suggestion. You all know, I think, I know this is in another place far away, but somehow I think word of these controversies has penetrated. I mean, I read the European press, and it seems to be everywhere. One is, what was the impact of the FBI director's decision to reopen the investigation into Hillary Clinton's email? Hillary Clinton's view, and many other people think it was to destroy her election chances. Then there is the question of the Russians. Now, the Russian questions are always surfacing in the United States. They were surfacing just before I was born, and there they are back again. So first thing we want to do is brush past these. Right? And I can't spend a lot of time on this, but let's try to repose the question. Just briefly on Comey. The issue is, what impact was the announcement? Now, this graph is not innocent. We're not trying to mislead you. We simply took it out of Marcy Wheeler's column, which was a very nice one. The fundamental problem is this, is it true that the Comey announcement actually sank her candidacy? There is a good deal of evidence that the polls were turning before that. Most of the discussions on this have ignored the fact that there was an announcement that attracted a lot of ordinary people, and which Trump did jump on how the premium for the Affordable Care Act, the health care bill, the cost of being covered by health care, we're going to rise 20% in the next year. That in Washington, D.C., that doesn't necessarily make it into the bubble, but there is, I think, a lot of evidence that it made it into a lot of other places. When yesterday, Ben Page and I reported how the normal Democratic advantage on social welfare and what you might call New Deal type domestic issues disappeared in the electorate. It just was the dog that did not bark. This sort of thing maybe pulled the dog right out of the yard at the last second. But one gets into endless issues on how do you want to estimate change in polls. But where we come out is quite skeptical. If you look at the Iowa markets data, this is the data betting odds on elections. Now, we're not trying to tell you that betting odds are, there's been this long argument about, are betting odds better than polls? They were both pretty bad. In 2016. They were both pretty bad on Brexit. But if you're looking for sort of evidence on what sort of unbiased accounts of what sentiment be, they're not too terrible, and they are, I think, demonstrably pretty good at incorporating polls, even though when you look at the literature on this, they all think the advantage is they're better than polls, but they're really talking 6 months out. Anyway, no matter how you slice and dice this, I think you got to be at least a little skeptical of the Comey effect, because if you notice in those Iowa market data, the drop on Hillary starts a couple of days before Comey makes his announcement. There is something else, though. When you look at these, how did this election turn? There's some missing elements. People are now starting a bit to talk about vote suppression. There is no doubt at all that in a number of states, take North Carolina, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, for example, the Republicans were doing their best to suppress voter turnout. Now, you don't have to guess about this. You can look at a New York Times piece and just say, where they are quoting folks in these states. I mean, they were just, until the controversy started really mostly after the election, people weren't being very guarded. Now, the question about, is it the Russians there? Let's think about that one for a second. Let me just put it this way. We think if you look at Google Trends and use it, you can't actually get that much evidence that the Podesta emails were that big a deal. Now, there's two sets of email drops. There are actually more than that. But there one around the time of the Democratic Convention, another in October. Basically, the one in October is competing with things like Trump's famous audio on how he likes to approach women. And I think the best guess is that most Americans didn't care a lot about Podesta, and that lots of the claims that people have been made, when you start checking them in individual states, don't check out. The claims about internet targeting are all over, and there are a lot of people now with a lot of incentives to vastly exaggerate them. Thus, on this, just a couple of comments. No one is going to try to argue that the Russians sat out the American elections on their hands any more than, the Americans have sat out various elections all over the world at different times and different places. That's silly. But the notion that most of the internet targeting that matters is coming from Russia is a little crazy. Rob Ferris had a nice presentation yesterday, a big diagram of sort of how the American internet world shaped up in the weeks before the election. And, most of these dots are clearly made in America. The whole industry is a sort of Anglo-American operation. Beyond that, when you start looking at the individual cases that people talk about, my favorite is the Texas one, where somebody put out a story leaked from, I think, one of the House or the Senate staffs that were investigating this, about how, well, they called all these rallies on Texas independence in October. Well, now think about that one. I mean, the idea that you could flip Texas for Hillary Clinton by anything is just a non-starter. What are they doing wasting the cash on that? Which leads to an interesting observation, which is if you look at that Oxford Martin School study that came out about 10 days ago, they have this table in there, purports to be an analysis of Twitter, which, perfectly willing to accept for several weeks. And they have a subset of all those messages in there saying, well, some of this is Russian stuff. They know very well that it is not all Russian stuff. They'll be there. But here's the point. When you look at their big table, they say, well, we have evidence that the Twitter stuff was targeted on the battleground states. How do they do that? They do it by, are you on the top half or the bottom half, battleground states versus all the other states. And what they find is that there are more battleground states in the top half. Think again. Look, if that's what targeting is, it's pretty bad targeting. It's worse than the American aerial bombardments in World War II, which famously didn't get most of their bombs within 20% of the target. They should be targeting the battleground states. You can treat this as a special case of an exam in American politics. What are the battleground states? You didn't have to be real smart to do this. All you had to do was read the New York Times or any of the various Nates, Silver and all the others that were telling you the battleground states. And so they should have got just about all of them right. If you accept their list of battleground states, they get, I think, 7 out of 13, 6 out of 13, I forget the exact numbers. Bottom line, if that were an exam in American studies, you'd fail. And so I think there is a study of Facebook that makes us another like that by Jonathan Albright. When you look at what he's doing, and I like Albright's work a lot, he shows you that many of the Russian Facebook stuff are running after the election. That's a bit late for targeting. And the conclusion, I think, has to be these folks were messing around. High-quality targeting, it was not, okay? But there is another way. You could still say, okay, look, any feather counts, right? This is a point there are other explanations for what's going on in those final days. One thing that surely cost Hillary Clinton a lot is right here. The union membership decline in those 3 battleground states that Shannon Monat mentioned yesterday, the Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, those were stupendous losses of unionization inside the Obama administration, where neither the administration nor the Clinton Foundation did any visible thing to stop it. And it's very hard for me to believe, or my colleagues too, to think that there wouldn't be a few thousand more Democratic votes in those states if anybody had done anything to stop that. But let's finally, this is where we would like to reorient the whole discussion on the business about, let us say, the feathers in the scales. If you graph the Iowa market prices for contracts on the Clinton presidency and a combination of a Republican House and a Democratic Senate, and the reason you can do that is because nobody thought the Republican House was anything but a lock, so that all the variation is in the Democratic Senate. If you look at the stuff on the far right there, you can see that not only the presidency contract price goes down, but the price for the House, for the Senate is going down too. You have a collapse of the whole Democratic show there. Now, the notion that Comey took out senators is bonkers. It's a little hard to believe that the Russians could do it, although frankly the thought that Vladimir Putin was supporting Mitch McConnell is so delicious one wants to at least think it could have happened. But in truth, it's not. And this is an extremely interesting point. We now pass to look first at there was this enormous surge of dark money for Trump. It was much bigger than Romney's. Now, somebody could say, how about total spending? There, Romney did better, but just follow the red line there. Now look at I'm sorry, let's go back. I will ask you to believe, because we're going to deal with it in a separate paper on the linear model, for which we now have international evidence that it's true, thanks to Julia. There was a similar wave for the Republicans on behalf of control of the Senate. Mitch McConnell went around and was saying, you can't afford to lose the White House and the Senate, so help us. And they did in enormous amounts. You have actually a dual wave of money that hits here. It's not the same folks. The Kochs, for example, that were focused on by everybody before the election with all New Yorker books and profiles and everything else. Nope, they never went for Trump. That reconciliation did not happen in money, but it did work for the Senate. Our position on this, therefore, is, look, you should probably, it's not like nobody is going to try to make off this a conclusive argument. Best guess is the two waves of money sank both Hillary and the Senate campaign of the Democrats. She was able to recover. She had a lot more money. The Democratic senators didn't. You get the usual results. If this is 2016, we'll come back to this a little later. That's the Senate you want. You got that same result in the end, the one we always get. Now, we admit two-way causality. That's obvious. We used in our earlier paper that Julia mentioned, it's a latent instrumental variable to sort that stuff out. 2016 is going to be wonderful because the Republicans were way, way behind. Nobody can argue that people are given lots of money because they think they have to go with the winner. They are desperately trying to create one. Anyway, so question is, what's distinctive about the 2016 presidential race? If you read the political scientists, Bartels, who has, let us say, many gifts, but also a sure instinct for the toenail in many of the things, the usual answer is nothing. Why? Because if you're looking at the split among votes, you're not going to find it. The Romney vote looks like the Trump vote with a few differences. Now, if you tease that a lot, if you put it under a microscope, like Paige and I did yesterday, you can begin to see some significant differences. And for sure, there's some additional blue-collar votes that, they swing. Yes, all that's true. But the aggregate number, you're not going to find giant changes. The voting patterns in 2016 strongly resemble 2012. But, the whole world has changed in some fundamental. What happened that you get candidates not only in the Republican Party, but in the Democratic Party who are completely anti-establishment? Everybody knows they just went through an earthquake. And the answer is, if you are living in Pompeii and you don't look at Mount Vesuvius, you have a problem. So obviously what we think is not votes, but money and patterns of investment are distinctive. And indeed, they are almost without precedent in America. We'll give you examples in a second. Let me just make a quick comment, though. In this account of an investment approach to political parties, we are not talking Grossman and Helpman or any of the stuff that has been done in economics on usually somewhat critical in the media votes, say we can move this a little bit. No, the point of the investment approach as we do it is this, that only financeable positions can go before the population. That means you can very easily, as long as there's less than perfect information and real transaction costs, the whole population can want something and they can't get it. It can't be financed. And so you will be sitting there with what looks like party competition. There are all kinds of industrial interests out there. That's the whole essence of this investment approach that we actually operationalize. We will not do this today, but we can show you how sector by sector breaks down and what's going on in there. We have all the numbers. They're in tables. They're in our paper. They are not, you just can't do everything in 20 minutes. But the point is, you can be miles from the median. You can stay there for decades. That's, in fact, what most democratic political systems do. So we're not trying to just nudge somebody, move them off a point or a little like that. Okay. So what's distinctive about 2016? Just a couple of items you want to look at. There's too much information on that table, but that's life. Look at the unitemized stuff. Actually, I can do it this way. Where Trump less than $200, 38% of his contributions. Now, when we're talking, let me make this clear, even when we talk about a contribution from a corporation later, we do all the cash. We unify the federal election database with the Internal Revenue Service stuff, but they do 527s. Think of 527s as a weird kind of super PAC. That's what they are. And we put all that stuff together. They're completely incompatible databases. Then we have to sort of identify these folks, and we do the work that nobody else does. We will sort through the 8 different versions of the names and the 4 different houses that are listed there, put them all together as best we can, which is usually pretty easy to do, and then unify them there so that the result of this is, of course, that we come out with much higher rates of concentration in political money than everybody else, including the stuff you read in the American Economic Review or the APSR, American Political Science Review. Guess what? They just haven't done the work. Okay, anyway. I will ask you to believe this now, because this goes beyond the paper. But I've been looking at political money for a long time and did a lot of historical work. I don't believe, with the possible exception of *64, when Goldwater ran, and he ran on a set of contributions that was very different from anything else in the Republican Party. He was a real one-off. There. With the possible exception of '64, we're not clear. We're actually looking at the '64 base a bit. Nobody in the Republican Party has run with major candidates. Minor party candidates run them all the time. We showed in our paper on 2012 in the International Journal of Political Economy that lots of these minor, especially the folks running from the far right, they would often get what was that? Michelle Bachmann, for example, had a very large percentage of small donors. So I'm just looking at this clock. This is set up. Am I taking the whole thing? I will be quiet. Anyway, here's the bottom line. Trump and Sanders both run on small donors. Trump, of course, does not just run on small donors, but that type of investment is without precedent. I apologize, Trump. Go ahead and do your thing. You go talk about the election.
So we just want to leave you with something we think is important about Trump, and that his campaign occurs in 3 phases, if you will. So during the primary, he does. I mean, he runs on his own money, more or less. Rides around in his own plane, and becomes elected by about 5% of the population that voted for him in the primary. Now, he can't take that mindset into the general election, no matter, so in this journalistic account here, right, he thought he could use Twitter to actually go over the heads of the media, and he wouldn't have to raise, $2 billion, even though there have been great documentation of how much that free media attention was worth. He actually had to go get big donors. So then in the interim, you do have Trump receiving money going into the convention. However, his money then starts to flatten out after the convention compared to Romney. So Trump is the red line here. These are 3-day rolling averages, means. And the spike there is a bit of an outlier, but his money still ramps up going to the convention, slows down afterwards. Then you get that third phase where it didn't happen right away, but after Cruz drops out, Cruz's big funder, Mercer, brings Steve Bannon and Kellyanne Conway onto the campaign, and there's sort of a rally around Trump effect within some of the big Republican donors. And what we find is typical Republican industries: tobacco, chemicals, oil, some telecom, and again AT&T. A lot of those are individual donors. Rally around Trump, and then you're going to have industries, and watch this soon, that would be in support of tariffs as well around Trump. So just to make this point, the big donors then in that third phase that come around, obviously Adelson, Icahn gave early and late, bigger late, Paulson gave as well. So then these typical Republican donors circle the wagons around Trump, right? Now, what's interesting here is Bannon and Conway both had a very narrow path to victory. I do not think that they expected to even win the popular vote. They were looking at very particular states, especially those states that we've been hearing about throughout the course of the conference, these dual economy type of states, and those distressed areas that did end up voting for Trump. Right now, what was going on the Clinton side? She was forming a big business coalition, and she reached out to neoconservatives by heightening and making public her stance on Syria. Now that big business tent, right, and it results in, and this is just a small subset of what we'll show in the paper, and that her donor profile, as Tom mentioned earlier in the earlier table, and in terms of industry, starts to look more like Mitt Romney in 2012. And so then the consequence, we are asking you to entertain this idea, the consequence of having that big business coalition would be that her campaign completely ignored any policy issues going into the general election. She focused mainly on candidate quality and vis-a-vis Trump. And that's a result of trying to maintain this huge coalition, right? So then going forward with Trump, right, what can we expect? Well, he had a haphazard, right, coalition behind him in terms of investors, and that could be one reason why you see this haphazard governing style as well, right? And so basically want to leave you with that and this idea that Trump certainly did not spend his whole time running on a shoestring budget. You have to look at his campaign in three phases. And so we'll leave you there.
Thank you.
I thought they were counting down to
So we have about 8 minutes for questions. I was going to ask a question, but you know what? I'd rather have the audience ask questions. So if you want to ask a question, I guess you can go up to the mic and ask a question. Does anybody have any questions?
I think we got most everything across.
I certainly can ask questions. Yes.
Let me ask a question about Macron elections in France. Could you elaborate more on those private donations, please? Thank you.
Yes, so I think Macron election is a very interesting case of the fact that when people was arguing that money can play a role in the elections, the answer was to say no, there is strong limits. So let me tell you how much someone could have spent for Macron now that we have a sense of like the price of a vote. You could have given 7,500 euros twice, once at the end of 2016 and at the beginning of 2017. So you could have given first 15,000 bucks. Second, you can contribute 4,600 per elections. So you could have given like 4,600 for the presidential election. Same thing for the legislative one. And then we have senatorial election in December. So at the end of the day, despite the threshold, people were allowed to give up to 30,000 euros to Macron. Then now, if we look at, we don't have, so there is an issue in France compared to the US. One, there is no transparency. So basically, they have to report the total number of donations. But since 1995, they no longer have to report the name of the donors. So one of the things I want to do, and this will be next step, you need to go directly to the commission to have all the list of the gift. But first thing they need to do is to erase the name. But at least you see how much different people contribute. So one of the stories Macron was willing to sell to the French people was to say, okay, like this is like popular kind of contributions, like Obama style or Sanders style, but it does not match the numbers. And what the numbers tell us is that a couple of thousands of people contributed up to this 30,000 euros limit. Now, if we look at the very first decision that have been taken by Macron administration, there were a wealth tax in France. It suppressed it. There were some labor regulation in France to protect, labor law. There is no longer any labor laws in France. There were progressive taxation on capital. Now there is a flat tax, 30% flat tax. So I can tell you that if you were rich and willing to pay to make your life better and to be sure that you will pay less tax, 30,000 bucks was not a huge contribution. And when you see then the estimation of what is the price of a vote, it can have moved a lot of vote in the first round of the election. The second round is another story. Like the only big question was who was going to get qualified in the first round.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. That's all super relevant research, but I want a little bit about the policy conclusions from that, because the solution can certainly not be to stop party financing, because we want parties to campaign and to inform people about their political agenda, and they need some money for that. And I think we even want to see some lobbying happening, because to a certain degree it's an efficient way for legislators and policymakers to get expert information. So my question indeed is, and I think this is what Mirko highlighted a little bit, it's very much about transparency in the end, and of granting egalitarian access to money and to information. And yeah, my question is how to ensure that, to solve the issue without without forgoing all the positive effects of having financing for the political process and of having information induced into the legislative process.
Okay, we're running out of time. So my brief comment there is that I think kind of transparency is the first step, or it's the first weapon in the armory, right? And what we've shown in the case of our paper is that there's this kind of framework or tool of transparency that doesn't seem to be working, and we need to introduce additional reporting and monitoring regulations and mechanisms to deal with that. Okay, so I see transparency as one big tool, and then the other big tool that, for the general issue of money in politics that we have to discuss, is public financing of elections, and to what extent we want to shut down channels for private donations. And if any of the other panelists want to comment on that.
Public financing is obviously the way to go. The issue here is very straightforward. Either everybody pays a little, or the people who pay a lot dominate the system. On the lobbying question, though, I mean, think again. An awful lot of the problem here is that the government actually functions as a kind of recruitment device for private interests, the revolving door in your great paper. You do need to close that door. One of the ways to do it is to pay people in government enough so that they're not running out. What an awful lot of people do now is go in for 2 or 3 years, and then check out and immediately get lifted into a salary that's 4 to 10 times more than they were making. That process has to be stopped. That is incidentally a way of money in politics that has nothing to do with elections, but which is enormously powerful.
If I can add like 2 quick things. The first one is that you can have very rich and active parties just with public funding and no private money. So this is the case of Belgium, for example. In Belgium, you cannot give more than 2,000 bucks to parties a year. So they are poor from private donations, but they are very rich from the state. And so they campaign a lot, so first point. And second, I think transparency is not enough. Look at Germany. For Germany, we have all the data. So if you look at private donations by firms in Germany, you will see that all the big car industry players, they keep giving money, not to 1, not to 2, but to all the parties. Why? Because they want, and who talk about that? Nobody. Because you have the data on the Bundestag website, but nobody look at the data. So you're much more in, no, I know, me too. Yeah. But not the general public. So I'm more like on the Tom side. In a sense, we need to no longer private donation. Like in the UK, you have transparency, same thing, like money play a huge role. So we need transparency for lobbying, but for money in campaign, I think we need public funding, and we need to put a ban on private donations, or much lower threshold.
And the German data have big holes.
I think that's all the time that we have for this panel, so I want to thank everybody for your presentations, and thank you for coming.